lot of people, as they drive by here, think that they're passing by an old concrete testing facility. In fact, I heard this story. As a kid going past here, my dad would tell me, yep, they put these concrete pillars in the ground to test how strong the concrete was. And I accepted that story for decades. It was only recently when people began asking me, what is the history of this place, that I started digging into the archival record. And it turns out that it wasn't the case. This is in fact the remains of a cement manufacturing plant. So if you're standing in amongst these concrete pillars, it almost seems like they're positioned randomly, just all over the place. However, if you go up in the air and look straight down, what you realize quickly is that they're not random at all. They're actually in a perfect circle, and the diameter of that circle is about 70 feet. The pillars, the individual columns, are in a perfect grid. They're nice rows, nice columns. You know, clearly they were put here with a design. It wasn't that they were just rammed into the ground at random. So what was this supposed to be? So the whole story of this site was that it was going to be a cement manufacturing plant. They would have had to have had a storage facility. They would have had to have, a silo in which they could store the finished product, the finished cement. And that would have been a big cylinder, a big sort of silo. It probably would have been really heavy, would have needed to be supported by piles. So my suspicion is this is where that silo would have sat. There's a second site just over to the south of this one. There's another large circle for probably a second silo. They would have two of them for storing the finished cement. But there's also two more of these circles in the background. They're smaller. They're not quite as large in diameter. This one is 70 feet in diameter. The two back there are 50 feet in diameter. What would they have been? Well, they would have needed a kiln, somewhere to raise the temperature of the limestone high enough to create the lime. My guess is that's where the kilns would have sat. And then there's another structure over in the middle between these two. There's sort of a large, almost boxy structure. No idea what it was to be. Absolutely no idea. So the story of this site began in May 1963. A company called BACM, which stood for British America Construction and Materials, announced that it was going to build an $8.5 million cement manufacturing facility. Now, the idea was that this company, BACM, made, among other things, concrete products. Of course, to make the concrete items that they sold, they required cement. Well, they had to buy it from a company called Canada Cement. They had a plant in the southern part of Winnipeg, and because there was a single source, I would imagine that the cost was therefore not negotiable. BACM felt that if they could get a better price, of course they could make a better profit. They announced in May of 1963 that they were going to build their own cement manufacturing plant. Now what's interesting about that is that just a month earlier, another company, a third company called Inland Cement, announced their plans to build a cement manufacturing plant. But they couldn't just announce the plans to build a plant, they had to show they were serious. So in November of 1963, they began building the plant. They began driving these piles. Turns out there was some negotiating went on in the boardrooms. Well, before the plant got too far along, Inland announced that they had purchased this site from BACM. In other words, they had paid them to basically stop construction. There were therefore only ever two plants, because Inland did carry through on their plan to build a second plant, and in fact the plant was just recently demolished. So it's interesting that we had a possibility of having three plants, and today we have zero. This sort of site really interests me. I'm always fascinated by stories of abandonment, because I think it really reveals something about how Manitoba changes. We look at old one-room schoolhouses and we see how that turned into large, multifaceted schools today. Or we look at small grain elevators and we see how that has turned into the massive grain elevators today. They reveal change, and I think this site also tells us something about how Manitoba changed. That at one time there was a busy period of construction in the 1950s, and then especially during the 1960s, they were building stuff all over the province that required concrete. So companies responded to that demand and they started building these sorts of facilities. So the fact that 3 companies went head to head in 1963 to build cement manufacturing plants, to my mind, illustrates that time period when there was a demand for cement that was driven by all of the construction that was going on. I love these abandonment stories because they're just so evocative of the history of Manitoba.